Thomas Harrow woke with a start, his sheets damp with sweat. The dream again, a woman with silver hair standing at the edge of a lake, beckoning him toward the dark waters. For weeks now she had haunted his sleep, her face both familiar and strange. At 42, Thomas had built a respected psychology practice in Boston, specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy. Jung's analytical psychology was something he'd studied, of course, but had always regarded with academic skepticism. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, lunch with Professor Emerson, his former mentor. Thomas showered quickly, trying to wash away the lingering unease of his dream. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, "You cannot run forever." Professor Emerson was already seated at their usual corner table when Thomas arrived at the cafe. At 76, the old man still carried himself with the same dignity that had commanded respect in lecture halls for decades. "You look troubled, Thomas," Emerson said, studying his former student's face, "like a man being followed." Thomas attempted a dismissive laugh. "Just work stress. Nothing interesting." "Interesting is precisely what I'd call it," Emerson replied, sliding a worn book across the table. "You mentioned dreams in your last email. Perhaps it's time you revisited this." Thomas glanced down at the faded cover, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious by Carl Jung. The book sat unopened on Thomas's desk for 3 days. Patients came and went, executives with anxiety, college students with depression, couples in crisis, all receiving his careful, evidence-based interventions. Yet each night, the silver-haired woman returned to his dreams, now speaking words he could almost understand, leading him deeper toward the water. On the 4th night, Thomas finally opened Jung's book. His academic resistance softened as he rediscovered passages about the anima, the feminine unconscious in men that Jung had described as both dangerous and essential. The anima is both a personal complex and an archetypal image of woman in the male psyche, Jung had written. She personifies all feminine psychological tendencies within a man. Thomas read until dawn, memories of his psychology courses returning. Jung had warned that men who ignored their anima risked becoming rigid, intellectualized, and emotionally stunted, but men who became possessed by it could lose themselves entirely. As the sun rose, Thomas wrote in his journal for the first time, "In years, what if my dreams aren't just random neural firings? What if she's trying to tell me something?" Among Thomas's patients was Michael Donovan, a brilliant software engineer whose marriage was dissolving. During their session that afternoon, Thomas listened differently as Michael described his frustrations. "She wants emotion, connection, all that stuff I'm not wired for," Michael said, pacing the office. "I've provided everything else. Financial security, a beautiful home. Why isn't that enough?" Thomas found himself considering Michael's situation through a Jungian lens. Was Michael projecting his undeveloped anima onto his wife, expecting her to carry all emotional aspects of their relationship? "Michael," Thomas said carefully, "have you considered that the qualities you find mysterious in your wife might be qualities you've neglected in yourself?" Michael stopped pacing. "What do you mean? The parts of ourselves we don't acknowledge don't simply disappear. They affect our relationships in ways we don't recognize." For the first time in their sessions, Michael sat down, truly listening. The next morning, Thomas received a letter with a Portuguese postmark. Inside was a conference invitation from the Jung Institute in Zurich, along with a handwritten note, "Your grandfather's legacy awaits you. The time has come." It was signed by Dr. Sofia Castellanos, a name Thomas didn't recognize. His grandfather, Robert Harrow, had been a Jungian analyst who died when Thomas was just 16. They'd been close, but Thomas had never followed his grandfather's analytical path, finding refuge instead in more concrete psychological approaches after Robert's death. Thomas called Professor Emerson, Sofia Castellanos, Emerson said, his voice warming with recognition. She and your grandfather worked together for years. Brilliant woman. I'm surprised she's still active at her age. Why would she contact me now? And what legacy? Your grandfather's journals, perhaps. He was documenting something significant before he died. Case studies of men experiencing profound anima manifestations. He believed it was becoming a pattern. In modern men, Thomas felt a chill, like dreams of a woman calling you to water. The silence on the line lasted several seconds. Thomas, Emerson finally said, I think you should go to Zurich. Before making any decisions about Zurich, Thomas drove to his mother's house in the suburbs. Eleanor Harrow, now in her 70s, maintained the family home with the same meticulous care she'd always shown. Their relationship had grown strained after his grandfather's death, when Thomas rejected the Jungian path. I wondered when you'd come asking about your grandfather's work, she said, leading him to the attic. Especially after you started dreaming. Of her. Thomas stopped on the stairs. How did you know about my dreams? Eleanor smiled sadly. Robert had the same dreams before he died. A woman with silver hair calling him to water. He called her his Anima guide. In the attic, Eleanor unlocked a trunk filled with journals, photographs, and letters. Your grandfather believed the Anima doesn't just represent a man's feminine aspects. In times of psychological crisis, she emerges as a guide or a warning. Thomas picked up a photograph of his grandfather standing beside a dark-haired woman at a lakeside conference center. He turned it over. Robert and Sophia. Lake. Zurich, 1982. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? Thomas asked. Because you chose a different path, and I respected that, Eleanor replied. But now she's calling you, just as she called him. 2 weeks later, Thomas found himself in Zurich, walking the same lakeside paths his grandfather had walked. The Jung Institute stood as it had for decades, a dignified building overlooking the water. Inside, analysts and scholars from around the world gathered for the conference on contemporary manifestations of archetypal experience. Dr. Sofia Castellanos was now 87, her once dark hair now silver, her eyes still sharp with intelligence. When she spotted Thomas, she approached with surprising quickness. You have his eyes, she said, studying Thomas's face. The same way of looking at things, seemingly from the outside but always sensing the depths beneath. I'm not sure why I'm here, Thomas admitted. Because you're dreaming of her just as your grandfather did, Sophia replied matter-of-factly. And because something is happening that Robert predicted decades ago, a collective anima uprising. Thomas felt his clinical skepticism returning. That sounds rather mystical for a psychological conference. Sophia smiled patiently. Walk with me by the lake, Thomas. There's something you need to understand about why Jung warned men about the anima, and why that warning is more relevant now than ever. As they walked along Lake Zurich, Sophia explained, Jung identified the anima as potentially dangerous, not because feminine qualities are threatening, but because what remains unconscious has power over us. Men who repress their emotional, intuitive, and relational capacities don't eliminate those needs. They push them into shadow where they grow distorted. Thomas listened, watching the lake's surface ripple with afternoon wind. My grandfather was researching this specifically? Yes. Robert observed a pattern in men who'd achieved conventional success but felt profoundly empty. Their dreams often featured a feminine figure leading them to water, symbolizing the unconscious itself. Some integrated these experiences and found new psychological wholeness. Others what? Thomas prompted when she fell silent. Others broke down completely. The tension between their constructed identity and their suppressed needs became too great. Sophia handed Thomas a worn journal. Your grandfather documented 23 such cases, including his own. Thomas accepted the journal, feeling its weight in more ways than one. And you believe this pattern is increasing? I know it is. Modern life has pushed masculine identity to even greater extremes of disconnection from emotion, from nature, from the body. The Anima doesn't appear because she's an enemy, Thomas. She appears because she's trying to save men from themselves. That evening, Thomas met other conference attendees at a dinner overlooking the city. Among them was Dr. James Walker, a neuroscientist studying the brain activity of patients experiencing archetypal dreams. "We're finding fascinating patterns," Walker explained, showing Thomas brain scans on his tablet. "These dreams activate regions associated with both threat detection and healing. It's as if the psyche is simultaneously alerting the individual to danger and offering a path forward." Across the table, a Japanese analyst named Dr. Nakamura nodded in agreement. "In my practice in Tokyo, I see this phenomenon increasingly among successful executives, men who have mastered external metrics but are internally barren. Their dreams often feature feminine figures who lead them toward water. Like mine," Thomas admitted quietly. The table fell silent, colleagues looking at him with new interest. "Then you're not just a researcher, but also a participant," said Dr. Nakamura. "That makes your perspective uniquely valuable." For the first time in his career, Thomas felt his professional identity shifting from detached clinician to engaged explorer. Thomas had arranged for a colleague to cover his practice during his absence, but he received an urgent email from this colleague about Michael Donovan. Michael had experienced a breakdown after his wife left him, becoming alternately despondent and manic. He was now asking specifically for Thomas. Through a video call, Thomas saw the change in Michael. Unshaven, eyes both vacant and intense. "I've been having these dreams," Michael said, his voice unsteady. "A woman with dark hair keeps appearing, leading me toward water. I think I'm losing my mind." Thomas felt a chill of recognition. Michael listened carefully. "These dreams aren't your mind breaking down. They may be your psyche trying to guide you toward what you've been missing." "Which is what?" Michael asked desperately. "The parts of yourself you've neglected, emotional depth, connection, receptivity." Michael laughed bitterly. "So my wife leaves me, and now my unconscious is telling me I need to be more feminine? That's your professional opinion?" "Not more feminine," Thomas clarified. "More whole. There's a difference." After the call, Thomas sat by his hotel window, watching the lake's dark surface. Michael's crisis reflected his own questions. Was Jung right? Was the modern masculine psyche reaching a breaking point? And what would happen if men continued to ignore the call? Thomas spent the next day immersed in his grandfather's journals, finding detailed case studies of men experiencing anima dreams. Robert Harrow had documented their psychological journeys with compassion and insight. Case 17 particularly captured Thomas's attention. A surgeon who dreamed of a woman leading him to water for months before experiencing a profound psychological crisis. The man had eventually abandoned his practice to become a grief counselor, later describing himself as finally alive after decades of sleepwalking. Interspersed with the case studies were Robert's personal reflections on his own anima encounters, which had intensified in the year before his death. The final entry read, "She is not calling me toward death, but toward transformation. The water is not an end, but a beginning. I only hope I have the courage to follow." Thomas had always believed his grandfather died of a heart attack. Now he wasn't so sure. He sought out Sophia at the conference reception that evening. "How did my grandfather really die?" he asked directly. Sophia's eyes filled with sadness. "He followed her to the water, Thomas, not to end his life, but to fully embrace what she represented. His heart gave out during the experience, a physical failure, not a psychological surrender." "That sounds like a poetic way of saying he drowned himself," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "No, he went to meditate by the lake at dawn. His heart had been weak for years. Sophia touched his arm gently. The anima doesn't lead toward destruction, Thomas. She leads toward wholeness, even when that path is difficult. On the third day of the conference, Thomas attended a workshop led by a Brazilian analyst named Dr. Helena Morales. Participants were guided through active imagination exercises designed to facilitate conscious dialogue with anima figures. The Anima becomes dangerous when she remains unconscious, Dr. Morales explained. By engaging with her consciously, we transform her from an autonomous complex into an integrated aspect of the personality. In the guided meditation that followed, Thomas allowed himself to visualize the silver-haired woman from his dreams. In this conscious encounter, he could see her clearly for the first time. Not just silver-haired, but silver-eyed, with features that somehow reminded him of his mother, his ex-wife, and something entirely unknown. "Who are you?" he asked in his imagination. "I am what you've forgotten," she answered. "I am what you've dismissed as unimportant. I am what you need to become whole." "And the water, what does it represent?" Her smile deepened. "The dissolution of false boundaries. The courage to feel deeply, the wisdom that comes from surrendering control." When Thomas opened his eyes, he found his face wet with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. That night, Thomas received an alarming call from his colleague in Boston. Michael Donovan had been hospitalized after driving his car to a nearby lake and walking into the water. Fully clothed, a passerby had pulled him out. He kept saying the woman was calling him. The colleague explained. The psychiatric evaluation showed no previous history of suicidal ideation. He claims he wasn't trying to harm himself, just following where she led. Thomas felt a weight of responsibility settle over him. His exploration of Jung's ideas had directly influenced his approach with Michael. Had he unwittingly encouraged this crisis? He called Sophia immediately, explaining the situation. "This is precisely what your grandfather observed," she said gravely. "When men experience anima manifestations without proper understanding, the result can be either breakthrough or breakdown. Your patient is at a critical juncture. I need to go back," Thomas said. "Yes," Sophia agreed, "but not just for him. You're approaching your own critical juncture, Thomas. How you navigate it will determine whether you can truly help others through theirs." Thomas flew back to Boston the next morning, his carry-on weighted with his grandfather's journals and Jung's collected works. In the hospital, he found Michael sedated but stable, with a 72-hour psychiatric hold in place. "The doctors think I had some kind of breakdown," Michael said when he awoke. "But it didn't feel like breaking down. It felt like breaking through." "Tell me exactly what happened," Thomas urged. "The dreams became more intense after our video call. The woman wasn't just beckoning anymore, she was speaking. She said I'd built my life around a false self, that I needed to let it dissolve before I could become who I really am." Michael looked directly at Thomas. "So I went to the lake. I wasn't trying to die. I was trying to be reborn." Thomas recognized the symbolic language from his grandfather's journals, the same archetypal pattern emerging across decades and continents. Not a coincidence, but a constellation of meaning. "Michael, I want to continue working with you, but differently than before," Thomas said. "What you're experiencing isn't pathological, it's potentially transformative, but it needs to be approached with understanding, not fear." For the first time since his hospitalization, Michael looked hopeful. "You believe me, then? That I'm not just falling apart?" "I believe you're being called to become more whole," Thomas answered, "and I recognize the call because I'm hearing it too." Over the following weeks, Thomas began incorporating Jungian approaches into his practice. With Michael and several other patients experiencing similar phenomena, he facilitated conscious engagement with anima manifestations through dream work, active imagination, and creative expression. Michael started painting, awkwardly at first, Then with increasing fluidity, his canvases depicted his dream woman in various settings, evolving from a distant figure to a close companion. In therapy, he began exploring the emotions he'd suppressed throughout his life: grief over his father's early death, fear of vulnerability, longing for deeper connection. "I always thought these feelings would make me weak," Michael confessed during one session, "but acknowledging them is the hardest thing I've ever done." "There's a kind of strength in it I never expected," Thomas nodded, recognizing his own parallel journey. He had started dream journaling, recording his continuing encounters with the silver-haired woman. She no longer called him to the water. Instead, she walked beside him, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, always guiding him toward greater emotional awareness. In his professional life, Thomas began writing a paper connecting his grandfather's research with contemporary cases, documenting what appeared to be an accelerating pattern of anima manifestations in modern men. 3 months after returning from Zurich, Thomas wrote to Sophia, "I believe I understand now why Jung warned men about the anima. Not because the feminine within is dangerous itself, but because approaching it unprepared is like approaching a powerful ocean without knowing how to swim. The danger lies not in the water, but in our relationship to it." My grandfather was documenting something significant, a pattern that seems to be intensifying in our time. Men who have built their identities on hyper-rationality, emotional detachment and control are experiencing powerful compensatory responses from the unconscious. The anima appears not as enemy, but as guide, calling them towards psychological wholeness. Michael continues to improve. The integration work is challenging but rewarding. He's reconnected with his wife, not to resume their marriage, but to understand his part in its dissolution. He speaks of seeing her as a person for the first time, not just an extension of my needs. As for me, I've decided to establish a specialized practice focusing on men experiencing these archetypal crises. I'm calling it the Harrow Center for Psychological Integration, honoring my grandfather's work. The silver-haired woman still visits my dreams, but now we walk together rather than her leading me toward water. I believe this represents my growing conscious relationship with these previously unconscious aspects. The question remains, why is this pattern accelerating now? What is it about our current moment that is constellating such powerful compensatory responses from the collective unconscious? I intend to focus my research on this question, building on my grandfather's foundation. Sophia's reply came 2 weeks later. A single sentence: "You have found your path, just as the anima intended." 1 year after his journey to Zurich, Thomas stood at a podium at Harvard Medical School, presenting his research to a conference on masculine psychology in the modern age. The Harrow Center had grown to include 3 additional therapists, all trained in integrative approaches to archetypal manifestations. Jung warned men about the dangers of the anima, not to perpetuate fear of the feminine, but to emphasize the need for conscious relationship with all aspects of the psyche, Thomas explained to the gathered clinicians. His warning was ultimately about the dangers of one-sidedness, of building an identity that excludes the qualities traditionally associated with the feminine: emotional depth, receptivity, relational connection, and intuitive wisdom. Our research suggests that as modern life has pushed masculine identity toward even greater extremes of disconnection from emotion, from nature, from the body, the compensatory response of the unconscious has intensified. The anima appears in dreams and active imagination as a call toward wholeness, a reminder of what has been neglected. When this call is misunderstood or ignored, the results can be catastrophic: depression, addiction, relationship breakdown, even suicidal ideation. But when approached with understanding and courage, it offers a path toward psychological integration and authentic living. After the presentation, a young psychologist approached Thomas. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "You've taken his work into a new generation." Thomas smiled, thinking of the silver-haired woman who still occasionally visited his dreams, no longer calling him toward water, but walking beside him as a companion and guide. Jung's warning was never about avoiding the feminine within, he replied. It was about approaching it with the respect it deserves, as a gateway to becoming fully human. That night, Thomas walked along the Charles River, watching moonlight ripple across the surface. The water no longer seemed threatening, but inviting, not calling him to dissolution, but to reflection, to depth, to the continuing journey of becoming whole.